History remembers Hitler as one of the most evil men who ever lived. But what if he wasn't the only monster responsible for unimaginable human suffering? What if I told you? Entire villages vanished without war. Millions starved while governments hid the truth. Families disappeared overnight. And some rulers built systems so terrifying, people were afraid to even whisper their own thoughts. One dictator forced millions into starvation in the name of progress. Another turned schools, cities, and even intelligence itself into crimes punishable by death. One regime became so brutal, wearing glasses could get you executed. And the darkest part, some of these leaders were treated like heroes by their own people, while millions suffered in silence. Tonight, we're uncovering the dictators whose names became symbols of fear, death, and absolute power. From communist China to Soviet Russia to the killing fields of Cambodia, these are the rulers connected to some of history's darkest human tragedies. The deeper you go into these stories, the more terrifying they become. Number 16 dictators more brutal than Hitler. Whenever people hear the word dictator, one name almost instantly comes to mind: Adolf Hitler. His role in World War II and the Holocaust made him one of the most hated figures in human history. But many historians argue that Hitler was not the only ruler responsible for unimaginable suffering. Across different countries and different time periods, several leaders built regimes based on fear, war, starvation, forced labor, and political terror. Some of these dictators controlled entire populations through propaganda and surveillance. Others created systems where even speaking against the government could mean prison, torture, or death. Millions of innocent civilians became trapped under brutal governments with no freedom and no escape. Entire villages disappeared. Families were separated forever. Political opponents were executed. Massive famines destroyed populations while leaders remained in power. In some countries, people were forced into labor camps. In others, wars and military occupations caused destruction across entire regions. What makes these stories even darker is that many of these rulers stayed in power for years while the world watched in silence. Some died peacefully despite the suffering linked to their rule. In this video, we're exploring 6 controversial leaders whose names became connected to mass death and historical tragedy. From communist China to the Soviet Union to Cambodia and colonial Africa, these are the rulers whose actions changed millions of lives forever. These are the dictators history still debates today. Number 2, Mao Zedong, the leader linked to one of history's deadliest famines. Mao Zedong was the founder of communist China and one of the most influential political leaders of the 20th century. To his supporters, he was a revolutionary who united China after years of war and foreign occupation. But to critics, his rule caused one of the deadliest human disasters in modern history. In 1958, Mao launched a campaign called the Great Leap Forward. His goal was to transform China into a powerful industrial nation within a very short time. Farmers across the country were forced into giant government-controlled communes. Private farming was discouraged or banned, and ordinary citizens lost control over their land, crops, and even daily life. The government demanded impossible production targets. Local officials became terrified of reporting failure because criticism could lead to punishment. As a result, many lied about harvest numbers, claiming farms were producing far more food than they actually were. Because the government believed there was extra food available, huge amounts of grain were taken from rural villages. Meanwhile, ordinary people began starving. The famine spread rapidly across China. Families were forced to eat leaves, tree bark, insects, and anything they could find to survive. In some areas, entire villages collapsed from hunger and disease. Historians estimate that between 20 and 45 million people may have died during this period, making it one of the deadliest famines ever recorded. But Mao's campaigns didn't stop there. In 1966, he launched the Cultural Revolution, encouraging radical youth groups called the Red Guards to attack anyone considered anti-communist or disloyal. Teachers, intellectuals, artists, and government officials were publicly humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Historical monuments and ancient cultural sites were destroyed across the country. Despite the suffering linked to his rule, Mao still remains an important national figure inside China. Some remember him as the founder of modern China. Others remember the enormous human cost of his political campaigns. Number 3, Hideki Tojo, the military leader behind Imperial Japan's expansion during World War II. Hideki Tojo became one of the most powerful military leaders in Japan. As Prime Minister and senior army general, he strongly supported Japan's military expansion across Asia and the Pacific. At the time, Imperial Japan believed it could become the dominant power in Asia through military force. Japanese troops invaded multiple countries, including China and parts of Southeast Asia. But with this expansion came destruction, occupation, and massive civilian suffering. One of the most controversial events connected to this period was the Nanjing massacre in China during 1937. After Japanese troops captured the city, reports described large-scale killings, violence, and atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. The event remains one of the darkest chapters of World War II in Asia. Another horrifying symbol of Imperial Japan's wartime actions was Unit 731, a secret military program accused of carrying out brutal experiments on prisoners during the war. Historians continue studying the full scale of these activities. Across occupied territories, civilians faced forced labor, starvation, imprisonment, violence, and severe military repression. Entire cities were destroyed during military campaigns. Hideki Tojo believed Japan's military strength could secure victory and expand the empire. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered World War II, transforming the conflict into a global war. As the war continued, Japan suffered devastating defeats. Bombings destroyed major cities, millions died across Asia and the Pacific, and after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered in 1945. Following the war, Tojo was arrested, tried for war crimes, and executed in 1948. Today, his name remains strongly connected to Imperial Japan's wartime aggression and some of the most controversial actions of World War II. Number 4, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator who ruled through fear. Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades and became one of the most feared political leaders in modern history. After Vladimir Lenin's death, Stalin slowly removed his political rivals and gained total control over the Communist Party and the Soviet government. Once in power, he created a system based on fear, surveillance, censorship, and absolute loyalty. Stalin pushed rapid industrialization across the Soviet Union. Massive factories and state projects were built, while agriculture was reorganized through forced collectivization. Farmers were forced to surrender private land and work on government-controlled farms. Many resisted these policies, but resistance was crushed harshly. The changes contributed to severe famines, especially in Ukraine during the early 1930s. Millions suffered from starvation while food was still being collected by the government. During the late 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, one of the largest political crackdowns in modern history. Government officials, military officers, intellectuals, journalists, and ordinary citizens were accused of being enemies of the state. Secret police arrested millions. Many people were tortured into confessions, executed, or sent to prison camps known as Gulags. The Gulags became symbols of fear throughout the Soviet Union. Prisoners were forced to work in freezing conditions with little food, poor medical care, and brutal treatment. Many never returned home. Fear spread across society. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Families stopped trusting each other. People could disappear overnight simply because of suspicion or political accusations. Despite this brutal system, Stalin also led the Soviet Union during World War II and helped defeat Nazi Germany after enormous Soviet losses. Because of this, Stalin's legacy remains deeply controversial. Some see him as the leader who industrialized the Soviet Union and defeated Hitler. Others remember him for political terror, executions, forced labor camps, and the deaths of millions. Number 5, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea's isolated regime. Kim Il-sung became the founder of North Korea after World War II and built one of the most isolated and tightly controlled political systems in the world. After Korea was divided into North and South, Kim established a communist government supported by the Soviet Union. Very quickly, North Korea became a state centered around military power, propaganda, and strict loyalty to the ruling regime. In 1950, the Korean War began after North Korean forces invaded South Korea. The conflict quickly became one of the deadliest wars of the Cold War era. Millions of soldiers and civilians across the Korean peninsula were killed, injured, or displaced. Entire cities were destroyed during the fighting. Even after the war ended, North Korea remained isolated from much of the outside world. The government controlled speech, media, travel, education, and access to information. Citizens were expected to show complete loyalty to the state and to Kim Il-sung himself. Political opponents and suspected critics could face imprisonment, forced labor, or harsh punishment. The government also created a massive personality cult that portrayed Kim as a heroic and almost supernatural figure. Supporters claim Kim defended North Korea's independence and protected the country from foreign influence. Critics argue that his rule created decades of repression, poverty, fear, and political isolation. His leadership shaped North Korea's political system for generations, and many structures created during his rule still exist today. Number 6. Pol Pot, the dictator behind Cambodia's killing fields. Pol Pot led Cambodia's Khmer Rouge regime during the 1970s and became responsible for one of the deadliest genocides of the modern era. Pol Pot believed Cambodia should become a completely agricultural society without cities, religion, education, or modern culture. When the Khmer Rouge took power in 1975, millions of people were forced to leave cities almost immediately. Families were marched into rural labor camps, where they worked long hours under brutal conditions. Food was extremely limited, disease spread quickly, and people constantly feared punishment. The Khmer Rouge viewed educated people as enemies of the revolution. Teachers, doctors, students, journalists, and intellectuals were especially targeted. In some cases, simply wearing glasses was enough to make someone suspicious. Anyone accused of disloyalty could be imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Secret prisons became symbols of fear and brutality during the regime. Historians estimate that around 2 million Cambodians died from starvation, forced labor, executions, and disease during Pol Pot's rule. After the Khmer Rouge collapsed, mass graves were discovered across Cambodia. These sites became known worldwide as the killing fields. Even decades later, Cambodia continues dealing with the trauma caused by one of history's most brutal regimes. Number 7. Leopold II, the king linked to Congo's colonial atrocities. King Leopold II of Belgium controlled the Congo Free State during the late 1800s, and his rule became one of the most controversial examples of colonial exploitation in history. Officially, Leopold claimed he wanted to bring civilization and development to Central Africa. But behind that image was a brutal system focused on extracting rubber and other valuable resources from the Congo. Local villagers were forced to meet impossible rubber collection quotas. Armed groups enforced these demands using violence, fear, and punishment. Workers who failed to meet quotas could face beatings, imprisonment, torture, or death. Entire communities were destroyed. Families were separated. Villages lived under constant terror as exploitation spread throughout the region. As the global demand for rubber increased during the Industrial Revolution, conditions became even harsher. Historians estimate that millions of Congolese people died due to violence, forced labor, starvation, disease, and population collapse during this period. Eventually, missionaries, journalists, and activists exposed the horrors happening inside the Congo Free State. International outrage forced Belgium to take control away from Leopold. Today, Leopold II remains one of the most controversial colonial figures in world history. His legacy is remembered not for progress, but for exploitation, brutality, and the suffering of millions. Number 8. History's darkest leaders still haunt the world. History is filled with powerful leaders who promised change, strength, and national greatness. But in many cases, absolute power led to fear, violence, and unimaginable human suffering. The dictators we discuss today ruled through propaganda, military force, political terror, and strict control over their populations. Millions of innocent people became victims of war, famine, forced labor, executions, and repression. Some of these leaders are still defended by supporters who believe they modernized or protected their countries. Others are remembered mainly for the destruction linked to their rule. But one thing remains clear: when governments gain unlimited power without accountability, ordinary people often suffer the most. These stories are not just about the past. They are warnings about how dangerous unchecked authority can become. History remembers the victims, the survivors, and the consequences left behind by these regimes. And even decades later, the impact of these dictators still shapes politics, societies, and historical debates around the world today.